So welcome back to another installment of Hello World, our workshop series for beginners, and especially right now focusing on JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and web development. This week is I knew there's probably going to be not a whole ton of people since, studying for finals and all that. So we're just going to do kind of a general Q&A. If you've missed any of the last couple sessions, or if this is the first session you've been able to make it to, and you have questions about what we've been doing, then this would be a good time to ask them. Or if you just have general HTML, CSS, JavaScript stuff you're curious about, you can ask and I will give my best shot to answer. Then also I have this application, kind of a clock with a little reminder, so I can kind of show you how this works if you want to see. So it displays the time up here. It's just in military right now because I haven't really configured it a whole lot. But if we want to say set a reminder, so right now it's 38 after. So let's set it for like 39 and 30 seconds just so we can see it work. All right. Oh, AM. Oh, now it's already passed. Shoot. Okay. So I'll change it to, let's say 33 seconds here. And then it will just silently take that in. And when the appropriate time arrives, and this should be the actual correct time. Yeah, this is the actual correct time. Then we'll get a little alert with our message there. Good for reminders. So I said to remind me to do the feedback form in this other one, because I always forget to do that. So yeah, we can dive into this if people don't have any questions. But if people do have questions or want to take a look at what we did the last couple of weeks, go ahead, feel free and ask away in the chat. All right, I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions in the chat, so let's. Oh, first, if you want to grab the code for this right now, so we can try to build it if you guys want. There's not a whole lot of us here today, so if you want to try to actually build this here, we probably can do it. It's not too much. Oh, this is the wrong app. There's not too much going on, so we could probably build this. Or if you just want to grab the code and kind of look through it, we can do that as well. So let me send the link for that in the chat. We have a question. Any videos or documents you recommend to look more into JavaScript? Yeah, that's a tough one. So there are a lot of resources out there for learning JavaScript and web technologies, but you have to be careful because a lot of them are outdated. That is a huge problem with just kind of the internet in general. Is that this stuff gets outdated like pretty quickly in terms of, let me put this, okay. So if you clone that link, if you type, so if you want to get this code and you have Git set up, if you don't have Git set up, you can ask me how to set that up right now. We can do that. We cover that in one of our first meetings. But if you just type this and run it, then it will download the code into a folder called alarm clock. So I already have it, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. We have that. Yeah, so anyway, back to the question in terms of like videos or documents looking more into JavaScript. Be careful that you're looking at newer, try to make sure you're looking at newer things because there are a lot. JavaScript has evolved a lot, especially over the last decade and even 5 years. So you want to make sure you're looking at more recent resources. I will say what I use a lot, the way I learned it was mostly through MDN. So Mozilla, the people behind Firefox, they do a great job with web development. They have a whole, so MDM stands for Mozilla Developer Network, and they have documentation for web development that is always up to date and it's really good. W3 Schools is pretty good as well. If you just want to know like specific, it's really good for like specific things. So if you just want to know, like a specific, let's say we want to learn about the select tag. That's actually one of the things we use today. You can get a very kind of specific sort of short page that gives you a good summary of the information, and they keep this up to date as well. So those two are ones I can recommend. There are probably lots of other good ones out there. Just make sure you're looking at more recent stuff because there's a lot of outdated stuff out there. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at this code. So yeah, if you want to grab that code, you can grab it here. Links in the chat. You can clone it from there. If you're not sure how to clone it, definitely feel free to ask me. So let's take a look at what's going on here. Basically, we have some of this is maybe not necessarily built the best way. So you have your kind of basic HTML document laid out here. And then we have a container for our clock. And then basically we have kind of like three main sections. We have our clock up here, which is constantly ticking. I'll show you how to do that. We have this reminder text with a selection box here. And then here where you can put in the time, you have these drop downs. And then of course we have a button. So the HTML for this is pretty simple. And there you can do this in a less verbose way. I just chose to do this way because it was simple for me to do. But basically, we have a lot of divs. We have right here. So this right here is our container for our clock. So if you notice, it doesn't actually have any text inside of it. To start, we're going to render that with JavaScript because it has to change. So it's not like static. We can't just put a time in there and it would stay the same. So that's the pattern you see a lot. Down here, we have, this is more of a static thing. So we have our reminder text, right? That's right here. And our input, which we have to put an ID on. Then we have these drop-down menus. And the way you do those is with this select element. It gets you this drop-down. I have styled some of these to make it look a little different. But you can kind of look in the CSS and see what's happening there. I'm not going to focus too much on that today. And then we have all of these option values. So I'll show you the distinction why you have to kind of type this value and then also something in here. There is a distinction. But yeah, so we have all of our options for hours and all of our options for minutes. You might notice this is kind of like, okay, this must have taken me forever to type out. And yeah, it did. But also, you could render this in with JavaScript. So if we have time or if people are interested, I can show you how you would render this into the page with JavaScript instead of manually typing all of this out, which is kind of a hassle. So you have that, you have for seconds, and then your AM, PM. Then we have our button all the way down here. So the main action that's going on is inside script.js here. So at the top here, this is something that I do a lot. You can do this other ways, but usually I just try to select all of my elements at the top. So if you were here last week, you'll remember that query selector is the preferred way to grab a hold of an element in the DOM. So your document object model, right? So if you weren't here last week, your document object model is how JavaScript represents the HTML page. So you can use JavaScript for many things. You don't have to use it for the web, but if you do use it for the web, then you have this sort of document object. Notice like we didn't set this up anywhere, right? Like this is the top of the file. It's something that just exists. It's there. And that's kind of our window into the HTML that's on our page. So when we do something like this document.querySelector and then #clock, if we head over to the HTML, right here, you see we have clock, right? So this ID equals clock. That's why we have all these IDs. So every ID gives us, that's a way for us to access and pick out that particular element in our script. So up here, we pick out our clock. Basically, these are all the different elements we pick out. So we have our clock. That's this main section up here. We have our reminders. I believe that is this text box here, although not sure. Let me check. Let's see what reminders actually is. Oh yeah, okay. So I don't actually think this is used for anything. So I probably can just comment that out. Because we can check in the HTML. Yeah, okay. So that's not actually an element. That must have been something I had before and got rid of. So I don't need that. We have our button, we have our text box. So button, text box, and then we have these are our drop downs. So that's what these hours options, minute options, second options, AM, PM options. Each one of those refers to one of these specific drop downs you can use here. The other thing we're going to need is, so basically, if you saw the way this works, you can set multiple reminders. So every time you have a reminder, like we need to store a list of that somewhere. So that's what this reminder list is. doing here. And if you're more familiar with like C, for example, where you have to like pre-allocate the amount of memory you need for your list, that's not something you have to do in JavaScript. It will just automatically grow your array as it doesn't have enough space. So you can just kind of start with an empty array, and then as you add new elements onto it, it will grow itself. So you're totally fine. And it'll manage the memory for you as well. So that's one nice thing. Then here we have a function. So if you recall, there's a few ways you can make functions in JavaScript. Sometimes you'll see, these are the two main ways you'll see. So you can see either this way, where you type function and then put your parameters here. Right, so you can have all your parameters in there. I'm using the const style. There's not a whole lot of difference between exactly how they work. But I usually use the const one just because I think that one's a little more obscure and confusing. And so it's good for you to see it so you can kind of get used to it. The idea behind this is you just have this, the name. So you put the name here. So const and the name. And then this right here is the argument list. So there's no argument. So that's why we just have these two parentheses. So you have an arrow. And I'll put a space in between so you can see the arrow is just an equal and then a greater than. So together, that creates this arrow. It may not actually turn into an arrow in your font. Like I had to get a custom font to do it to make it turn into an arrow like that. But it will look like an arrow either way. And then inside the braces, you have your code. So this right here, set reminder, this is kind of the core part of actually setting up a reminder. So we can go over that in a minute, but let's take a look through the rest of the stuff we have here as well. We also have a function to check our reminders. So let's actually go to the bottom so you can see the logic of basically what's going on. These three lines are kind of the core of this, the entry points to this application. So remember in JavaScript, you don't have the ability to block on things. So in a language like C, you might use, if you wanted to like update the clock constantly, how would you do something like that? Well, you might sleep. You might do something where you like sleep, you have your program, like you run a sleep command and sleep for a second and then update the clock, and then sleep for a second and then update the clock, and sleep for a second, update the clock. With JavaScript though, you can't really actually ever sleep. And the reason for that is JavaScript can only have one thread of execution. So the way JavaScript actually works is it can only do, just like you and me, it can really only do one thing at a time. It's not capable of multitasking very well. So if it's sleeping, then it can't do anything else for you at all. And you might think, okay, that's not so bad. But if this JavaScript was sleeping, then let's say we tried to press the button. If it wasn't at the exact time that it had woken up to tick the second, then we wouldn't be able to interact with the UI. None of that JavaScript stuff would work. So to get around this, the way you write most applications in JavaScript is with more event-driven approach. So instead of just saying, okay, we're going to have a while loop and wait around until a second has passed or wait for things to happen, you instead have sort of an event-based architecture. So that ends up looking a lot like this. So these set intervals these are a special function. And the first argument is a function. So if we want to look at kind of like, okay, what is the type of our set interval? Like if we were writing our function set interval, what would that look like? Basically, it takes in two parameters. The first parameter is a function, and the second parameter is milliseconds. And then what happens is it will run this function after that many milliseconds has passed. So what this does is this set interval doesn't do anything immediately, but after 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, it's going to run this update clock function. So you can see update clock is right here. So it's going to run this function after a second, and then every second it's going to go ahead and run that again. So that's how we're able to constantly update the clock. So yeah, that's what's going on there. If you're not used to seeing functions passed into other functions, that's a common pattern that's used in JavaScript and any event-based architecture, because you need to be able to have a way to say, do this thing later. Down here, we have another set interval. Every 1,000 seconds, we also want to check our reminders. So this is checking basically This update clock, all it does is redraw the text here to show the next second of having passed. But this check reminders, what that does is check to see if, okay, now we're at a new time, is it time for any of our reminders to trigger? So far we haven't added any on this one. But if we did, so let's say we add one here for 7:54. So we can go do that. All right, that looks good. And we can just do, I don't know, hello. All right, so we set that reminder. So as soon as we set that reminder, it's just sitting there in the background. Now, every second, it's actually checking to see if we've reached that time that we put in. So it should reach there in about 10 seconds, and we should see the pop-up. So that's your set interval. And then our last part here is kind of our click handler. So having event handlers is very common in JavaScript. Okay, so you can see right here, there's our pop-up. And we got to say hello. Cool. Okay, so over here with our add event listener, button.add event listener, and then we have this click and then set reminder. This is it's a similar function. So first it takes in what event you want to listen for. So there's other things than click. This is the one I'm using most commonly, at least in this series of workshops, but you can also do like on hover. So like, if actually we probably could do that here, but if you want to do something specific, like show an animation when someone hovers, or maybe when they type something, you want to check. The last application we wrote was watching all the keyboard input to see if the user hit enter. Then you can listen for other events. But in this case, we want to listen for the click event when they click this button. And basically, the second parameter you have here, the set reminder, is a function that should be called when that happens. So this is kind of the dominant style of writing. When you're writing an event-based program, because you don't know what order things will happen in, right? Because the user you need to have the clock always updating, but you also need to, every time they click the button, you need to add a new reminder. And there's no real way to know like ahead of time how many times that's going to happen or when that's going to happen. You know, they could sit on this page for like an hour and then do it, and it still needs to work, right? So instead of trying to like constantly check to see if they've clicked the button or anything like that, you handle it through these higher order functions with event listeners. So you just say, look, I'm not going to constantly check to see if they've clicked the button. If they do click the button, please call this function for me, JavaScript. And how that actually works is kind of interesting, but that's kind of gets into an advanced topic. But what you need to know is that using event listeners, and what this is kind of called like a callback. So callback function, event listeners and callback function is the main way that you write applications in JavaScript, and really any UI situation. So if you write like an app, you're going to do similar sorts of things. The syntax may be different. You may have different function names for this sort of thing, but you're going to have the same idea of listening for events to happen and then taking action when those events happen. So do we have any questions on that? Otherwise, I'm going to dive into actually these three functions, these update clock, set reminder, and check reminders, and we can see what exactly those actually do. All right, cool. Doesn't look like we have any questions. So let's just go to this update clock. It's right here, and that's kind of the simplest one here. So again, for this function notation, what this means is update clock equals, it is a function that takes in no arguments. So to update the clock, we don't need to have any outside information. And then here, what do we actually do? So the first thing we do here is grab the current date. So when you use this new date syntax, we're going to get into this later, but this is how you can do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. If you use Java, it works very similarly to that. The idea of creating a new date. And whenever you create a date, it always creates one that's like for the current time. So then after that, we can go and grab, so we get the current date and we store that into a variable or a constant called now. And then we go, okay, let's go to that now and let's do .getHours. So this is just part of the way the date API works. I actually let's just look this up on MDN. So just do like MDN date JavaScript. You can pull up and see the whole page all about dates. And you can see all the different functions there are, click through and see what they do, gives a short description. So basically that's how if you're like, okay, well, where is he getting all this from? That's how you can actually go and figure that kind of stuff out. So, okay, we grab what the current, how many hours have passed, and then we grab how many minutes, whatever the current minute is and whatever the current second is. Then we have this string function. So this capital string function, right? So we're taking this value, which is a number, and it will convert to a string. This works a lot like a cast in C would, or like if you use .toString. So and if you use to Java and you have like toString, that can also work in Java. I think you can use toString in JavaScript as well, but usually I just use the string function instead. So we take the number that we get back, turn it to a string, and we store that. So we store our hours, minutes, and seconds. Then to update the actual clock. So remember, the clock up here at the top is actually a reference in the document to the element that has the clock ID. So if we go back to our HTML, we can see our clock ID right here is inside this H1. So this heading is what's making it look so big, and there's our ID is clock. So that's what the clock is. It's this part of the HTML. It's just an empty heading, at least at the start. So once we call this function, though, we're going to set the inner HTML. So we could set this to anything, but we want to set to the current time. So we use hours and then colon, and then you have some fancy stuff going on here. So basically, there's two main ways that you can kind of, if you want to build up a string. So what we want to do is we want to have our hours, right? And then we want a colon, and then we want our minutes, and then a colon, and then we want our seconds, right? And so the way, there's two kind of ways you can do this. You'll see both. I prefer the second way. That's why I have this one commented, but this is also equivalent. So you can either create a string with pluses. So we can say, okay, we have our hours, then let's concatenate the colon, then have our minutes, and then concatenate on this another colon, and then seconds. You can do that. That's one way to do it. The other way you can do it is with this template string way. So instead of you make the whole thing a string, and then you can just write the variables directly into the string instead of having to have a separate string every time you break things up. So this is the backtick character. So if you go on your keyboard, if you have a full keyboard up to your 1 and straight to the left, you'll have like the tilde character. But if you press it without the shift, you'll get this backtick. So that's what this character is. So you have a backtick, and then you close the string with a backtick as well. And that's how JavaScript knows you're trying to use this special template string. And then what you can do is, instead of having to say, okay, take this string and then plus this and then plus this and plus this, in some cases that can get really confusing. So instead, you can just say, okay, you use this special syntax. So you do $, and then you have curlies, and then you put the variable name inside there. And JavaScript knows to take that whole thing and substitute it with whatever the value of that expression inside the curlies is. So it'll just take whatever our hours is and put it there. And then we have colon, and then we have our minutes. Now this pad start, if we don't include this, actually, this is a great time to do it now that we've just gotten past 8 o'clock. If we don't include this pad start, you may get behavior that you don't like. So let's go ahead and reload. So notice, okay, what's happening here? So we're still getting our minutes, and 1 minute has passed, but we're not getting that extra 0. So if we want to make sure that there's always like for seconds too, if we want to make sure there's always going to be a 0 there, if it's not making it to 2 digits, that's what this pad start does. So pad start just works on any string. You just do the string, the variable name, dot pad start. Then this number is how many characters you want to be. So we want it to end up being 2 characters total. And if it isn't already 2 characters, then put zeros at the front. That's why it's pad start, not like pad end. Put zeros at the front until it is. So that's all that does. That's just ensuring that we make sure it's 2 digits no matter what. And we do the same thing for seconds. So we get that whole string, and then inner HTML is just a way to straight up inject HTML into the page. So if you notice, let's go back to our HTML page, right? There's nothing inside of our tag here that would, whatever we put inside this tag is what normally would display. That's the inner HTML. So we're going to set that value So basically what we're doing is every second we're going to draw whatever the current time is. It's like we had typed it here, but it changes every second. So, we'd have this, but then it constantly is refreshing due to the JavaScript. And that's just not something you can achieve in just pure HTML. Okay, so we do have a question. Is it possible to clear the time that you set for a reminder after hitting the set reminder button? So yes, it would be. I haven't implemented in this, mostly because I think it might be useful to be able to set multiple reminders at the same time, but we could do something like that. What we would have to do is add a blank option. So I'm not sure what you would expect. You probably would expect it to go to like a blank option. By default, this always it doesn't have a blank option. It only has valid options. So you could always reset it back to 1 or something, but we would have to add another element for that. If we have time at the end, I can show you how you would achieve something like that. It's surprisingly more work than you might imagine. Is everyone on board with this update clock? And most importantly, is there anyone who is completely lost or not really sure what's happening at all? Remember, this is happening every second. So that's what this set interval does. Is you can kind of think of set interval or add event listener as some really observant person constantly watching and then tapping you on the shoulder when certain things happen. So this set interval is kind of like a event listener for every 1,000 milliseconds. It's like someone who's standing there and they keep counting, count 1, and then they tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, remember to update the clock. The same thing with the button. It's like someone watching that button all the time to see, okay, hey, someone clicked it, and they tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, remember to use set reminder. And that's how you can kind of think of the event, how the event-based architecture works. Okay, let's take a look at our this button that add event listener and the set reminder. So what's actually happening when we click this button, right? It adds the event, but what's actually going on when that happens? So we can head up to set reminder. Okay, so we're here at the top. So the first thing we do for set reminder is we grab the information. So if you remember from last week, we did a similar sort of thing. When you have one of these basic text boxes that people type into, what you need to do is first get a DOM reference. So remember at the top, these are all of our DOM references. In fact, I probably should put a comment for that. Oh, DOM references. Okay, DOM references. So these are all our DOM references. So notice we grab the button, and in our HTML, if we go to the button, you can see it has ID equals button. So that's why we're doing the hash button. So that's grabbing this specific button here at the very bottom of the page. So we're having that. So we're going to, we have the button. Oh, and we also have the text box. So the text box is this specific element right here. So we go to that text box, and text.box.value will return you whatever is currently in here. So whatever that is, first we want to store that into our own variable because we're about to overwrite it. So we need to make sure we have that. So we store that into this reminder text variable. You can call that whatever you want. And then we clear the text box. So we can actually just set that value and it will change it on the page. One thing that is cool for JavaScript especially is just using the browser console. So if you've never used the browser console before, you can just go to your settings, and there should be an option for web developer or browser console. And there's a toggle, and you can get these kind of tools. Chrome has a similar thing. And so if you head to this console, you can actually run JavaScript code right here. So if we want to check to see if that actually works, so let's do document.querySelector. And then we'll grab the same thing. So let's grab, what would we call that, text box. And if we grab that text box and then set the value to say, I don't know, testing, and you'll see it actually update it on the page. So you have it's the same thing that you can do from JavaScript code, you can do in the console here. So that's how you can interact with the values there. And if you of course you want to read that, so if we run the same thing and we just run it to see what's inside, it will return us that string that's currently there. All right, so that's pretty cool. So we can grab that, then clear the text box by doing this. Cool. The next thing we need to do is grab the actual time. So now we know this message we're going to save to report back to the user later so they know what the reminder was for. Because I don't know about you, but I frequently, at least before I had reminders, dedicated reminders app, or I started using my calendar for reminders. I would set timers for a reminder, but I wouldn't like write what the reminder was. And so I would set like a 2-hour timer and it would go off 2 hours later. And I have to like think for a long time, like, what was I supposed to do? Like, was it, like go do laundry or like make lunch or like, I would forget what I was supposed to do by that time. Maybe that's not a problem you have. But anyway, that's why I wanted to make sure there would be a message so that the user would know what they were being reminded of. So that's going on up there. Now down here, we're actually going to grab this time. So what's currently in these text boxes. So if we go back to the HTML, you can see how these text boxes actually work. They're very simple and really, you probably should do this in JavaScript to avoid typing all these out. Basically, so here's our drop-down menus. You can see our hours, minutes, seconds. That's rendering right here. And then we have this select. So the select HTML element, it works a lot like a list. So if you remember like our good friend unordered list and then all of our list items. Right, so if we just want to make a general list, you can do this, unordered list or ordered list, and then put list items inside of it. Well, select works the same way, but instead of making a list, it makes a drop down with those options. So inside here, inside of the actual like pair of tags itself, right? So here's our close option tag, here's our open option tag. Inside there is the actual text that will display for the option. So for this first one, in this case, that's going to be the same as the value. The value is actually what we're going to be able to read from JavaScript. So you can make those different. And a place where that actually does happen is down here. So for the minutes, I want to make sure that if it's 0, it's not just 0. It is 0, 0, right? To make sure, just to have that consistent format that people are so used to. So we have that. That's why we have 0, 0, 0, 1. But then the actual value, the number of minutes that we're reading back, there's no need to make that 0, 0. It's the same 0 in the program because we're just going to do math with it. So that's one case where it can be different. But you can also just make it whatever. I mean, you could just make it like hello or something, or pandas or whatever you like. But usually it's smart to make it something that actually correlates with the option. So down here, this is what I'm talking about when we do this dot value. So all of these, if you notice, each one of these selects has an ID. So this one for minutes has minutes, one for hours has ID equals hours, right? So let's take a look at our DOM nodes. So our hours option is grabbing that hours, minutes option, seconds option, AM, PM option are grabbing all of those selects. And then if you want to actually read what value is currently selected, you just use dot value. A lot like it works very similarly to the text box, right? To read what's in it, you use dot value. If you want to set it, you can also set it that way as well. But we don't want to set it, we just want to read it. So right here, we grab out the current value. So however many hours we're currently on. And then this is actually a nasty bug that I ran into while I was running this. It gives you that value back to you as a string. And that can cause some problems later. If you want actually, I'll show you what bug I was running into. But we use this number function to convert that string into a number. So we get our number of hours, we get our number of minutes, get our number of seconds. Now you might notice we have this let hours. And you're like, okay, he's using const everywhere. I'm a big fan of using const everywhere. So whenever you don't change something, put const. Don't use let. You should use const. It's just good practice. But down here, there actually is a chance we'll change the hours. And that's because even though this is displaying in military time, and that's something we can fix if we have time, right down here, most users are not accustomed to using military time or a 24-hour clock for inputs, right? They're more used to the AM PM system, at least in the United States. So in order to facilitate that, we only offer options 1 through 12 in our hours, but how will we actually convert it? Because internally, JavaScript uses 24-hour time. There's no way of getting around that. So how are we going to know what it is? Well, we can just check if the value of this last one, which can flip from AM to PM, is PM, then we're going to go to our hours and add 12. Note the triple equals. So, okay, first, that's why we need let. So anytime you plan to reassign a variable, just like we're doing here, right? We're doing this is really, if you're not used to this notation, that's fine. It's really just doing this. Anytime you're doing a reassignment, you're going to need to use let because const prohibits doing that. But if you don't plan to do reassignments, you should use const. And then note the triple equals as well. I talked about this at length last time, But basically, you should always use triple equals instead of double in JavaScript. And if you want not equals, then you can do the exclamation point equals equals. Don't do this version. It just has better, more intuitive behavior and will cause fewer problems for you down the line. Okay, so that's great. So we've grabbed the number, we have how many hours there are, we've adjusted it in case based on AM or PM. We have the minutes, we have the seconds. What are we actually going to do now? Set up our date object. So we're going to assume, we actually just assume in this program, and you could change this later, but we assume that they're going to want to be reminded the same day and like not down the road. And then, that's something that we can improve for sure. But for simplicity, we're just assuming it's the same day. So what we do here, when we grab a new date, remember this is very similar to what we did before when we were trying to grab the current time for the clock. So this actually is just grabbing a date that is pointing to the current time. But we can modify the parts that we want to modify. So we want to leave the day the same, the year the same, the month the same, all that's the same, but we want to change our hours, minutes, and seconds. So we set our hours to wherever the hours is, and our minutes to whatever we want the minutes to be, and the seconds to be whatever we want the seconds to be. Great. So now at this point, right here on line 40, we've managed to create a date that is tied to when we want the reminder to go off, which is good. And then this next part is we create a reminder object. So this is something that I didn't really cover in depth last time. So this might be something new to some of you. Unlike a lot of languages, this is not a feature that really is common in a lot of other mainstream languages. So if you know like Java or Python has something similar, but it's not quite the same. This is what's known as an object literal. So basically, if you wanted to create an object, you've all taken classes here at UCF, it looks like. So if you want to create an object in C, what do? Well, you go and you create a struct, right? So you make, or at least in my class, we're doing it with typedef. Right, so you might do like typedef struct reminder, and then you would put your different things. So we want to have a date, and we call it, date or whatever. And then we also want to have the text, the message or the string that the user is going to see, right? So you might make a struct like this. You might do something like this in C. You can do a similar sort of thing with classes in JavaScript. So I uncomment this. You can also, this does a very, very similar thing to this. Basically, you have this, you have to, instead of, it is a little more complicated, but you write this constructor that takes in the arguments that you want to be able to construct. And then you put in this dot date. It's very common to do it like this. Even though it might seem like a waste of time, you just have to do this. This dot date equals date. This dot text equals text. And then the way you actually would use a class like this is with new. So that's what that new is. So let's say we wanted to create a new reminder. So call it R. Constar equals new reminder. And then inside, reminder is a function, right? It's actually calling this constructor. So we pass in the date and text. So we would put in our date object, which we already created, and then whatever the message they wanted us to say it would be. And that's one way you can do things. That's a perfectly legitimate way to do things. That's why I left it commented here. Especially recently, this is actually a newer feature in JavaScript. It hasn't always had this. So especially recently, you're seeing more people do it that way. But the way that traditionally things were done in JavaScript, and you'll still see many people do, and I also just like it because it's simple, is the object literal. So the way that works, you don't have to define a struct or define a class or define like anything else anywhere else. You can just create an object with curlies. Sometimes you'll see these on one line, but the best way to think about it is kind of as a container. So this is a container, and inside of it, you just have key value pairs. So you have inside of our reminder, we have a date, and we want the value to be, in this case, this date we created up here. So notice you can kind of think of this as a string, like we can instead think just like reminder date. Okay, so this doesn't have to match. I know it's kind of confusing, but this thing on the right is the variable, or it could also just be a value. So maybe we just always want the message to be reminder or something. We don't care about that feature. then we can set our text to always be reminder. In this case, I want to go ahead and let it be whatever we read out of the text box. And same thing here. We want our date to be whatever whatever date we've created here on, what is this, line 36. We want that to be that. But we also want to call it date. So in order to actually use this later, you can just do, so reminder.date, and this will give you, that's going to give us back this object. Because this date that we created here, const date, is the same as this date here. And we can access it under a name of date. So let's say we change this to A instead to make it less confusing. Then reminder.a would get us that date. Reminder.text is going to get us that reminder text, the thing that was stored up in the text box, right? That's where we define a reminder text. So, and you can add more fields to this. You just have to comma separate them. And all you do is you just put key and then value. So whatever you want the dot to be, so then it would be reminder.key, and that would give us back whatever value is, whatever type value is. You don't have to put any types. JavaScript is dynamically typed, so you don't ever have to put types. That can cause some problems because sometimes things aren't the type you expect and bad things will happen. But it also has conveniences. Okay, does that make sense to everything? Or does that make sense to everybody? Object literals are very common in JavaScript. You'll see them, a lot of times you'll see them just pass straight as an argument. So you won't even see this happen. Like what people will do is, if you look at this line 47 here, this dot push is adding that thing to the back. It's like an append. I think in Python it's dot append. C++ it's dot push back. Different languages call it different things, but basically this is take that array and append something to the end. So we're going to append that reminder, but what you might see someone who's trying to save lines of code or just trying to keep things shorter, or for simple cases, what they might do is get rid of this whole thing and just put the object straight in here. You could do something like this. And this is legal. So it's a literal, just like so if you wanted to append like a 5 to this, right? You could just put 5. Well, the same thing, you can use this object as a literal. So you can store it in a variable, but you can also just create it directly without ever naming it anything. And this is definitely a common pattern you'll see people do. They'll just create a new object, maybe to return or to pass to a function. They'll create a new object, fill it up with some data, and then send it along. So that's something you'll see. Let's go ahead and put it back. Is anyone confused about that? Object literals can get kind of confusing. The syntax and it's not really something that's super common in other languages. So it might be confusing in that regard too. Basically, we're creating this object with storing our date and the reminder text. So the date we want to trigger the reminder and then the actual reminder itself. And then we are putting that to the end of our list. And remember, that list is just a list that we created up here. All right. And then we also do some logging. Sometimes when you're debugging, usually when you like finally ship something, you don't want to have log statements everywhere. But if you're just debugging or you want to see how, exactly how the flow of the program is going, it can be useful to have logging statements. So if you look here, actually, I wanted to make sure this was running every second. So if you look, it's actually smart enough not to spam the log. Since it's all repeated, this number here saying how many times this has been printed to the log keeps going up. So I've just been leaving this going. So it's already been printed over 1,000 times. So imagine 1,000 of these in the log here. Because remember, this is running every second. Or actually, wait, was that the same message? Hold on, I have another one. Oh no, this is actually a different message, right? So this isn't running every second. This only runs when we press the button. Sorry, my mistake. So this only runs when we press the button. This other one is actually a log statement late in the last function, the checking function, which is checking every second. All right, so we have a question. Is it possible to access that object even after a number of operations have been done on it? Well, I'm not sure what you mean. What do you mean by a number of operations? All right, while you're trying to reformulate that, I think the answer is yes to your question, but I'm not sure exactly what you mean by a number of operations. let's go ahead and look at what is happening in check reminders. Check reminders is actually pretty simple. So remember, we have our event-based architecture. We're using set interval. So in order to check basically every second we want to check to see, because we could do every minute, like if you want to, stress your computer less, although this isn't putting a lot of strain on your CPU, but if you wanted to do it less often and check every, minute instead, and that way you would only be accurate to within a minute, but maybe that's okay for your purposes, then you could instead check less often. But I want to be know within 1 second when a reminder is happening. So that's why I do this set interval with 1000 milliseconds for 1 second. So in addition, we're updating the clock, but we're also calling this check reminders function. So what does that actually do? Well, here's check reminders. We have a lot of commented code. I'll delete for now to get it out of the way, but I'll explain why I have that in a minute. Basically, we want to loop over this list and check if the current date is in the past. So that's what our code does. So it goes to this list, loops over each element and says, okay, what's the current time right now? It checks, it goes into that reminder object and says, okay, what is the date in the first reminder? Has that passed? Trigger the alert. And then it says, okay, if that doesn't happen, what's the date in the second reminder? And then it also removes the item from the list, because otherwise it will just keep triggering the reminder over and over, because it will always be in the past. So if we want to look what that looks like, I'm using so that's what these commented sections of code are. So if you're used to C, something like this probably would look most familiar to you. So we have this is our for loop with I. You can do this in JavaScript. The only real difference is you don't put int here. You just put let, because remember we have dynamic typing. So let our I be 0. And then to get the length instead of doing you don't have to store the length. In JavaScript, every array knows its length. So you don't have to remember that in your own. There's no an array is a pointer, none of that is a thing. If you want to get the length of an array you have that you don't know, you can just do that array name dot length. Very convenient. So this will give us whatever the current length of our array is. Your usual loop. I don't think I need to explain this. People should know what this is. Then we check. This is where we check. So if now, so let's see, why is this saying now? I think this should be date. Oh yeah, okay. I ended up changing this later. So this should be date.now. So date, that's the same thing. It basically gets what the current time is. So do that, get the time, and we check. You can actually compare dates with greater than equal to or less than equal to in JavaScript. So we grab the current date, which I think I was storing in a variable called now before. That's why I had now. And then we check, okay, is the current time greater than, go grab the element in our array that we're currently on, and then .date, because we don't care about the actual text right now. We just want to grab that date. And then check that time and see, okay, is our current time greater than the time in our thing? That means, okay, the reminder should be triggered, and we do this alert. And actually, yeah, okay. This, if we want to, instead of just saying a generic reminder, we can do reminders I, and then remember we stored that in text, right? In our object over here, it was text. So that's how we get back to that value. So we do that. So this would be one way to do it. Generally though, this style of for loop in languages is becoming less and less popular, mainly because the whole I business doesn't really have a lot to do with it. So this is another way you could do it with a for loop. So this is if you've used Java, it's like the enhanced for loop or the fancy for loop. It does a very similar thing. Basically, instead of iterating with a number, you can use this const, or you can also use let here if you prefer, but I always use const when I can. So you can do const R, so R for reminders of reminders. So this variable name is, basically what you're doing is you're declaring a new variable on each loop. That variable is called R. And what that is it's going to be one of the elements of reminders. So this works exactly the same as this previous one. But instead of having to use reminders I, right, because we're using this reminders I to access the element will instead just be stored straight into R. And I think this reads a lot better than having to do reminders I everywhere. because the I really doesn't really have a whole lot to do with it. So this is usually a preferred way to do it. And it works the same way though. Instead of reminders, I would just use r.date.getTime. You do the same thing. I have now because I had the variable before. And this you can do the same way. So we could do, instead of in here, we could do r.text. Same thing. But the way I actually prefer to do this, so those are two ways to do it. In JavaScript, you have a lot of options because it's evolved over a long period of time. So different people wanted different things. Like in the beginning, we didn't have this loop. This is like a newer thing that's come around. We've always had this. And I think we've had for each for a long time as well. So that's why you'll see those sometimes more often. But this way is also good. But anyway, this dot for each is a higher order function. And it's similar to our functions down here. So remember, our set interval can take in a function, and our add event lister can take in this function. Well, same thing with for each. So array.forEach, right? Because the reminder list. So this is our list name. If you look at the top here, reminder, that's the name of our list. So go back here to here. We do that list dot for each, and then for each takes in a function. In this case, I'm just inlining the function directly. So I could do something like this. Const, f equals this function, right? And then I could do this. So if this helps you to think about it conceptually, then maybe think about it like that. But if you're creating a variable just to use it immediately, it's kind of silly, right? Just like you wouldn't do, like say you wanted to do sum. You have a sum function and you want to add 5 and 6. You wouldn't do this. Right? Just creating variables to hold literal values. That's silly, right? Why would you do that? Unless you had good reason, like to name those for some reason. This is just a worse way to do this. Well, it's the same thing for this. Why would you create a variable to hold that function if you're just going to use it this one time anyway? So instead of storing it into some variable, you can just put the actual literal value of the function as an argument. So really, you can kind of think of this as like one extremely long line, because here's where our for each, our for each parenthesis opens, and here's where it closes. So this is all part of one, like kind of one line that is a function call. Just like you could do, if you wanted to, you could do something like this, right? You can add more spaces and more lines, same thing. But at least for functions, it tends to help readability a lot to use more than one line. Never do this. If you do this, people will hate you. Even though that is technically like how the computer will read it, it just looks much worse. So in our function, the way for each works is you give it a function that takes one argument, and that argument is going to be an item in the list. And then you do what you want to do with that item, and it will call this function one time on every single item in the list in order. So it works just like a for loop. It's just a different syntax. And maybe you like this method, maybe you don't like this method. Use it or don't. It's your choice. You always have the for loops available to you as well. But it's just another alternative syntax to achieve the same goal. We're going to loop over the list for each R or each reminder on our list. Do the same thing. So compare the current date with new date. Yeah, so this is what all these nows should have been. They should have been new date. And then this splice is actually what removes the item. So down here, this is where we do the alert and we actually give back the message saying, hey, the reminder triggered. And this splice here is what is removing the item from the list. So this is actually a way to like take a list that you have, pick one specific item and just chop it out. So that's what this splice is doing. Because if you don't do that, then every second when it relooks at the list, it will say, hey, this reminder happened in the past, and it will trigger the alert again. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's why we remove it. And then just for debugging purposes, before I was putting this checked all reminders in here, and that's what you're seeing showing up at the console. So it wasn't that other thing. Checked all reminders is what's continually going here, because every second it's checking. Does that make sense to everyone? Oh, okay. I see there's a follow-up on the question before. So in that example specifically, it gets added to the array, so it's able to be accessed through the array. But would there be a use case where you would pass an object just to use its data to modify another object without being stored in something like an array? Okay, let me see if I can break this down. So would there be a use case where you pass an object just to use its data to modify another object? Okay, let me see if I can try to guess at what you mean by that. Let me just. So if you haven't used Node before, I encourage you to get it. It's just a way to run JavaScript files on the command line. So you can just run Node and the name of the JavaScript file will run it. You miss out on some of the browser features. Like obviously you can't interact with the DOM because there is no DOM or anything like that, but you can. It's good for testing things like this. And it's actually used in like the real world for running servers, which are very important. Okay, so let me see if I can try to make an example. So let's just make a generic object. I don't know. I'll make an object that's me. Okay, so let's make an object that's me. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here we go. We have a basic object literal. What exactly do you mean in terms of doing this? So would there be a use case where you would pass an object just to use its data to modify another object without being stored in something like an array? So you could, maybe you want to have a function that's print person. Takes in a person. By the way, if you're not used to seeing this syntax, if you have multiple arguments like, A, B, let's say we're doing sum instead, then you have to use parentheses. But if you only have one argument, you can still use parentheses if you want, but most people will drop it because that's permitted. Okay, so let's say we're going to print a person, in this case me, but we can make more people if we wanted. Taking that person and let's console.log out some of the information. So this is that special template syntax I showed you before. Most people prefer this. The alternative to this would be to do just normal, the way you might be used to in other languages. Do this. I personally think this one looks better because you can, especially if you have multiple things, having the pluses can get more confusing than it's worth. Whereas being able to just put it in line, I feel like it looks better. But either one of these is going to work the same. So yeah, you could have an example like this where we take the person and let's say we want to print out all right. So you could do something like this. And then you can access the data that way. Is that sort of what you mean? Oh, except we should have gotten things. Oh, we didn't actually call the function. So I guess in this example, you could have a collection of UCF students where you continue to process new students and add their information similar to a student record system. Yeah, so that would be sometimes in this example, okay, you might think, all right, this is great, but why wouldn't you? You could do this in a way where you just have a separate variable for each of these. So like this, like you can do it without using the object literal. Maybe this is what you mean. this sort of a thing. And then you could just pass all of those as separate arguments. So you could do this, and then you'd have to write your function differently, but you could do a similar thing like that. But often it's best to bundle your data into an object when you have related data. Because one, it makes your calls more simple, right? Instead of having like 10 billion arguments, if you have a function where you're passing like, you know, I don't want to put a hard number on it, but let's say if you're at 7 arguments, you're almost, unless it's a very complex function, in which case you probably should rewrite it into a few functions, you're probably doing it wrong. Like 7 arguments, it's really starting to get, you shouldn't be passing lots and lots of arguments around. Most functions that you write should have no arguments, or 1 or 2 or 3 arguments. Having a billion arguments is just bad for readability and usually means your code is just written incorrectly. And so to help fix that, right, if you have a situation where you're trying to pass like 4 different things, maybe check and see if some of them are really part of the same idea, because then you can clean up all your call sites to just pass one variable like this. But yeah, you could, what's nice about this is you can have another object from another person. I don't know. So who's a good person to use for this? I'll just make up a person, Joe. Let's say they're you know, like an exact clone of me, except their name is Joe. Then you could also pass that person and then do the same thing. It'll work just the same. Is that what you mean? Maybe you could even have these in a list. So maybe you want to have a people list, and inside that list you want to have what you could do something like this. That's not what I wanted. So you have a whole list of people, and you could have, you could have more people down here if you wanted. And then instead of doing, well, now we can't just print one person, so we can use, this is where like array for each can come in handy, or you can use your for loop. And you can get the same sort of effect. Does that make sense to everyone? Or does that sort of answer your question? I'm not sure I really completely understood. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's exactly what I was asking about. Okay, I don't know when you said that, but yeah, you could do something like this. And really even, this is the reason I like the for each is if you're doing a 1 argument function like this, you can even slim it down to that. And I think this looks really clean compared to like, I mean, because you can do a for loop. So I guess this is kind of, a tangent, but this is sort of a tangential week. We can go off and do some tangents. If you wanted to do this with a for loop, at least like the preferred way, the best you can get is that. Or if you want to do it, you could do that or even do that. But I still think this is the absolute winner. So that's why I usually do it like that. But yeah, that object literals are very flexible. Something else that's interesting about object literals. So let's go back a ways. If you can also unpack an object literal in the arguments of your function. So let's do our print person function again, but let's do it a little bit differently. You can actually take that person and unpack them. So say we want to grab the name, grab the age, grab the college, grab the clubs out. And this is how you do that. And you can kind of think of it as like this. Like, so when you call this function, right, you're passing in this object, right? So you can really think of it as doing this, right? We're passing in that object, whether we have it named Rob or we just pass in the literal, it doesn't really matter. Now, if you don't want to have that object as one thing, if you want to go ahead and unpack it immediately, you can do that. And then you can access, like, this name will be Rob, the age will be Colin. And it has, as long as they're the same as the these keys, or this left part of these pairs here, then it will store all of those things from the object into values. And this is a common pattern you see as well, especially with like frameworks and things, where like React, this happens all the time. So you have some component and you have props you're passing in, but you want to only grab specific ones. So you do this sort of thing all the time. That's very common. So yeah, object literals, they don't let you do anything you couldn't already do with just like sort of your classes and like a struct, but they can simplify code, and they just give you another syntax to use. Although I will say, as for someone learning JavaScript, it's seeing people like, use and abuse object literals like this and use them everywhere can get confusing, because you're like, okay, there's just curlies everywhere. What do they mean? And, because it also uses curlies to show what's inside of a function or for other purposes as well. So I know it can get confusing, but they really are worth the time to learn. And it's one of my favorite things about JavaScript, actually. All right, with all of that cleared up, let's head back to our alarm clock. Oh, that's not what it's called. All right. So that is I think actually we pretty much covered all of the different stuff that, right? Because we went over updating the clock. Yep. And we went over how we're setting the reminder. Yep. And we went over the checking every second. And then I guess the only other thing that's going on here is I also have a call to update clock immediately. Because if we don't have this, then when you render the page for 1 second, the clock doesn't appear until it gets called the first time. And I feel like it's kind of jarring, especially if you're moving fast and you might want to be like, oh, I'm going to set my reminder now. And you click and then the whole page shifts. It's just better if the clock renders as soon as possible. So instead of, even though we know it's going to update every second, let's just immediately set it up for the first time here. So that's what this call does. That way, when you load the page, you just get a seamless pop in. Okay. What other questions do we have? Is there anything else you want to see? Or also, I refactored what we worked on last week some, or if you want to kind of explore the class, like if you haven't taken object-oriented programming and you aren't really familiar with that, we can talk about that. That's something that's used a lot in JavaScript. Or if you want to talk more functional programming stuff, I'll leave it up to you guys on what you want to do next. You've basically seen, I don't know if you've cloned this and downloaded it or not, but I mean, you've basically seen all the code for this particular application. The only reason it looks better than the other one is I did some work on the CSS. But yeah, that's that. I'll open it up for questions or if people have suggestions on what they want to do next. I guess what we can do is head back and maybe make some improvements to the to-do list. So let's head back to our to-do list. So this is what we were working on last week, much less pretty because I spent much less time on the CSS. I don't think I spent, like, honestly, here, let me check. I don't think we really I didn't really put anything into the CSS. There was someone who was asking, I forget who, but someone was asking last week if we could find a way to remove if you want, actually, I'll just show you. So now there's like that bullet and people wanted to remove the bullet and also remove the indent. And I did figure out how to do that. If you just set I think it's the padding, it's either the margin or the padding of your list to 0, then it will get rid of that. And you can do the same sort of thing. So yeah, that was the resolution for that. And for people who weren't here last week, I don't know, I think a good portion of you were, but basically what this let you do is you could make items, like it'd be like a to-do list sort of application, and you can check them and it'll strike through. And then after 3 seconds, it will go away. And then also if you decide, oh, I misclicked it, you can uncheck it and it won't go away. So that was basically what we did last week. You can see the code for that. You can see the code for that here. This is a lot. So this one's using a lot more anonymous functions. Sometimes this is something difficult, I would say, about knowing when to use anonymous functions and when not to. For short functions, it's often smart to use. So like for a for each, for example. So let's go back to our kind of our testing ground. Right, so let's say I just want to print these numbers out. So the way I would be inclined to do this would be like this. And notice how I don't pull this function out here into a new function. So I could do, this is kind of what we were talking about before. And then pass that in there. But if you're only going to use it once, then I make the argument that it's not necessarily wise to name it just to pass it immediately there. But sometimes it can be. So like in the like alarm clock, I did name some of the functions to help improve the readability. So like that way you can see, like I could have taken this update clock and put that here instead of, put that in here as this first argument instead of that. And that's how I did do the to-do list. So I did inline all those functions. That is like, it's largely a preference thing. So instead of having like a click handler function or whatever, I just pass in the anonymous function straight away. But that's mostly a personal choice. So it can be hard to tell when to do that and when to not. If your function is getting so long that like it doesn't even really fit on one screen anymore, then it's probably a good idea to split it out and give it a name. And when in doubt, I would say name your functions so people have an idea of what it does. Because this one, you don't necessarily know what this does just from the anonymous function alone. But if you did something like, so in this case, like, what does this even do? When we click the button, it adds an item. So if we could give it a name, sometimes a name can add a lot of value. So, you know, you might make the argument that doing this is much more clear, right? Because now we know, okay, what is this? It's a function that adds an item, and then when they click, we're going to add an item. That might be better than just having it inlined. So there's arguments to be made both ways there. You know, this is a little shorter, but in general, I'd say if you're not sure, then go ahead and make it some. Give it a name. If it's a long function. For short functions, usually not worth it. So that's what we did last week. And then I think, yeah, the first week we just installed. So if you don't already have Node, or if you don't have Git, we haven't done a whole lot of Git stuff, except if you wanted to grab my code, we've been using Git. But we will be getting into that in the spring. And Git is really important for one, like tracking, like if you want to actually see the history. So you can go to the alarm clock and you can check the log. Here, let's get the short version. You can look at the log and see, so these are all the changes I made. So first I add the license and then template files. And you can see, okay, I did the project skeleton, then I had some comments about HTML, and you can kind of see, okay, here I actually fixed some bugs. And then I originally only had an option for 1 to 59, so I added an option for 0. And then I added that function call to render the clock. So you can kind of see a timeline of all the things that have happened in the project with Git, which is one of the great features about it. And it's also really good for like rolling back. So let's say that I was having, you know, terrible problems with this version and I want to just go back to a version I know is working. You can easily do that with Git as well. So I have a whole talk on that on YouTube from the hackathon, but I'll probably be giving some version of that again on a Tuesday in the spring when we start back up. Because this is, if you didn't already know, this week is the last week for this year for Night Hacks workshops. So Thursday is the last workshop, and then we'll start back up again in the spring. Yes, very sad. Yes, it is. It is very sad. But don't worry. If you want, we have several workshops, all the hackathon workshops. There's no way you could have gone to them all because some of them had the same time as others. So if you want to have, you know, hackathon workshops all through winter break and into next year, you can go on YouTube. We have like a playlist, I think. All the hackathon workshops are up. And also, if you've missed any workshops over the last few months, then those are all on YouTube as well for the most part. You can head back and watch those and check that stuff out. So yeah, you don't have to be so sad. You can watch other Night Hacks workshops, but really, you probably should just take a break. You know, do your finals, enjoy your break. Do we have any other questions? I was hoping there'd be some more questions because this was sort of intended to be kind of a Q&A. If people, even if it's like about nothing you've seen here or something very specific, or even other languages or like frameworks, or if there's something else you guys want to, because we still have a good chunk of time. If there's anything else people wanted to discuss. If not, then I'll probably end things here.